I'll begin by describing four interacting aspects of constraints and choices. So if you can remember four words, here are the four to remember: population, economics, environment, and culture. And this description will explain why people are concerned about the question, how many people can the Earth support? And then I'll give some answers to these questions, to the question, how many people can the Earth support, and explain how they were obtained. None of the methods used is very convincing, I'm sorry to say. And I will propose 11 questions that have to be asked and answered to make sense out of that question, how many people can the Earth support? If you'd like more details, there are a lot more details in my book called How Many People Can the Earth Support, which is for sale outside in the back there. And I have a son in college, and you know how expensive that is, so do your best. The plan here is that I'll do most of the talking for about the next 50, 55 minutes, and after that we'll have a conversation. But if there's some point of clarification, or if I say something backwards, which I often do, feel free to put up your hand, and if I don't see your hand, just speak up. So that points of clarification, but not speeches, during my speech at least. I don't want to sell you any agenda of action. I'd hope to offer a perspective that will protect you from those who say that rapid population growth is not a problem at all, and from those who say that rapid population growth is the only problem. Well, where are we now? This slide is a few years old, so let's update it. Instead of 5.7 billion, we've got 1999, 6 billion people. The official date is October 12, 1999. That's pure science fiction. We don't know how many people there are on the planet to the nearest 100 million. Okay? But it's October 12th at 2 p.m. It's just that the UN hasn't decided what time zone. The annual increment, it's not 90 million, it's about 78 million. Two digits precision, we don't have. It's somewhere between 75 and 80 million. In other words, it's going up at about 1.3 or 1.4% per year. If that growth rate were to continue, which it will not, if it were to continue, the population would double in somewhere over 50 years. So you can see that we have more people than we had 4 years ago by roughly the population of the United States. In other words, we've added another USA. The population is growing more slowly, but we're still adding 80 million people a year, and our doubling time is longer. How did we get to this world? Well, this goes back 2,000 years. We are currently over here. And if you go back another 8 to 10,000 years, at the end of the last ice age, maybe 10,000 years ago, there were roughly between 2 and 20 million people on the planet, surely far less than the population of the world's largest city today. For the next 8,000 years, population doubled every 15 or 20 centuries, rising and falling in different times at different places. By 2,000 years ago, we had roughly 250 million people on the planet, which is the population of the United States today. And it took about 16 and a half centuries for the population to double again to 500 million. Now, if population grew exponentially, which is what you read in most textbooks, that would mean that its doubling time is constant. So from the end of the last ice age up to about 1650, the doubling time was on the order of 16 centuries. That would mean that the next doubling would take another 16 centuries, and we'd be at 1 billion over here. But what happened was that the old world and the new world began to trade people and resources, and particularly food crops, in such a way that nutrition improved dramatically in the old world, while the population actually fell in the new world as a result of infectious diseases. But with improving nutrition, The next doubling to 1 billion people occurred in under 200 years. So that was an 8-fold speed up of population growth. And that was previous to the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution kicked in, material prosperity of a large number of people improved so dramatically that the next doubling from 1 billion to 2 billion took less than a century. And in the 30s, with the discovery of penicillin, sulfa drugs, and cheap public health measures, the population growth rate accelerated again, and the population grew from 2 billion to 4 billion in 44 years. Looking back from where we are now in 1999, at 6 billion people, we passed 3 billion people in 1960, so the most recent doubling has occurred in under 40 years. That means we had a speed up of doubling time from 16 and a half centuries to 40 years, roughly a 40-fold speed up in doubling time. So we had a process like an interest-bearing account in a bank in which the interest rate increased with the balance in the account. The more money in your account, the higher the interest rate. That's what happened to population growth. If you can find a bank that offers a deal like that, I'd like to put my money into it. So as I said, the population doubled in the last 40 years, and never before the second half of the 20th century had any human being lived through a doubling of the Earth's population. Yet anybody in this room who's 40 years old or older has lived through such a doubling. And anybody who was born in 1930 or earlier has lived through a tripling. That has never happened before. In absolute terms, it took until 1830 to put the first billion people on the planet. We added the most recent billion people in about 12 years. So it's a new ballgame demographically. Well, let's go back. I call this my shower curtain slide because what it reveals is interesting, but what it conceals is at least as interesting. So what I'd like to do is zoom into the last 50 years over here and expand these 50 years to cover the whole slide and change the axis from billions of people to percent increase per year. And this slide reveals something, first of all, the most important demographic event in human history. And that is that the population growth rate of the world, which is this middle curve here, reached its all-time peak around 1965 and then slowly began to fall. And in the last third of this century, the population growth rate has been falling, although the absolute number of people added per year only began to fall around 1990. The second thing that this slide reveals, which the previous slide conceals, requires that I tell you a story about an ecologist, an economist, and a statistician who went on a deer hunt with bow and arrow. And they were creeping through the forest when suddenly they saw the deer. So the economist took careful aim and fired, and the arrow landed, as you would expect, to the right of the deer by about 5 meters. Then the ecologist took careful aim and fired, and the arrow landed, as you would expect, to the left of the deer by about 5 meters. Then the statistician looked at the two arrows and jumped up and down and said, "We got it! We got it!" So, hunting deer with the average arrow is approximately as useful as trying to understand population growth with global average statistics. In fact, there are two distinct worlds on this planet, a rich world and a poor world. The rich world had a population growth rate that has been declining for over a century and continued to decline throughout the last half century. The poor world had a low population growth rate at the beginning of the century, and at the end of World War II, as the rich world learned how to export health without exporting wealth, death rates dropped dramatically, and population growth rates in the poor countries surged to all-time highs. Only when the poor countries got a grip on their own fertility did they turn the corner, and when they turned the corner, the whole world turned the corner. I'd like to emphasize that the decline of fertility in China preceded the one-child policy, and that overwhelmingly this decline in fertility in the poor countries is a result of voluntary restrictions of fertility, reductions in fertility. Now, once before in the last 1,000 years, there has been a decline in the population growth rate of the world, and that was in the 14th century as a result of the Black Death. In that case, the decline was a result of increasing death rates and consequent reductions in fertility. Here, the death rates continued to go down, and it was a voluntary control of fertility. So this is a new phenomenon and a very important one. What this emphasizes is that the rich and the poor countries have quite different demographic histories, and they differ. Here we see the rich world and the poor world side by side in Dhaka. They differ, these two worlds differ in many other important respects. The rich world has about 20% of the world's people, the rich 1.2 billion. It's North America, Europe, Japan, the Asian tigers, if you will, Australasia. There are plenty of chairs. There's no reason to be uncomfortable. Come take a seat. Why sit on the floor? There are loads of chairs. The poor world is all the rest. The rich world, as of 1997, was increasing by 0.1% per year. The poor world, about 18 times faster. The doubling time, if this growth rate continued, the doubling time would be over 5 centuries. Whereas if this growth rate continues, the doubling time is 38 years. What does that mean? Well, if you take a typical lifetime of, say, 3/4 of a century, then at these growth rates, the poor world would double twice, 38 plus 38, which makes 400% increase, 2 doublings. The rich world would increase by about 8%. So we are in the middle of a massive shift in population proportions in the favor of the poor countries. And the only way out of that is either to change the relative population growth rates or to assure that the poor countries don't stay poor, that they become rich and convert over to the other column. The rich countries have about 22 people per square kilometer. The poor countries already have 55 people per square kilometer. I'm going to skip down here. 3/4 of the people in the rich countries live in cities, but a little more than 1/3 of the people in the poor countries live in cities. So if you look in the rural areas, not only is the population density overall 2.5 times bigger, but there's a much higher fraction living in the countryside. The direct contact of people with the landscape is enormously more intense in the poor countries than it is in the rich countries. The average woman in the rich countries has about 1.6 children per lifetime at current rates. The average woman in the poor countries has more than twice as many. There are more children, 35% versus 20% in the poor countries, and fewer elderly people. Life expectancy is shorter, and the most important difference is this income. Even if you don't believe GNP per person as a reliable measure of wealth, it is one index, and I don't believe it, but it's some index. 4/5 of the people on the planet are living on incomes of around $1,100 a year. And that includes 2 billion at the bottom who are living on approximately $1 a day. I don't know how much your tuition is here, but it wouldn't cover most, it would take a lot of years to cover 1 year's tuition. Whereas in the rich countries, the average person has an income of $19,000. Whoops. Now, I just pushed the wrong button, but I got back. So the problem with population is not numbers of people alone, but the poor quality of life for many of them. Is there a way to turn off the lights on the screen? This light is making it hard for people to see what's in the pictures. I'm talking about this flashlight right here. Better, but not quite good enough. Okay. Is that better for you? Thank you. I'm sorry. If you see other, operational problems, please alert me. So it's the quality of life, as I was saying, and I'm just going to touch on a few things here. Roughly 1 person out of 3 on this planet is infected with tuberculosis. This year it's about 2 billion people. Now, TB is a curable disease for which we have had the drug since it was discovered in 1951, and we don't use it. Roughly half the people in the world have no place to go to the toilet. They don't have the social organization that it takes to dig a hole in the ground, put a wall around it, and say, when you got to go, that's where you go. About 1 billion people are illiterate, and about 2/3 of those are women. And women get, on the average, half the higher education of males. Well, as people spread over the earth, so did their cultivated plants and animals. It's not widely known that people support a population of large livestock that totals 4.3 billion and outweighs the human species. In addition, we have a population of about 17 billion chickens, and these populations have grown more rapidly than the human population in recent years. Livestock consumed about 40% of all the grain that was consumed by anybody in the last 20 years. The average is about 40%. What that means is that for every 3 kilograms of grain that go into a human mouth, another 2 kilograms of grain go into the mouths of one of our domestic animals. And you lose 90% of those calories because of ecological inefficiency, and so the 10% that survive are consumed largely by the wealthy nations or by the wealthier people in poor nations. So we have enough food to feed a decent vegetarian diet today. We have enough food to feed a decent vegetarian diet to about 10 billion people. But we feed the equivalent of the diet for 4 billion people to our domestic animals. Now this is Morocco, and it's out of focus, so if you could take a look at the focus, I would appreciate it. This is Morocco, and those are goats. And does anybody know what they're doing up in the trees? They're looking for food, right. Even in Morocco, the goats don't have wings. The reason they're up there is that they're hungry, and you can imagine what that does to the regeneration of the forest. What was a forest, I should say. So our domestic animals have substantial environmental effects. I promised to talk about population, economics, environment, and culture. I've talked about population. Let's talk about economics very briefly. Human influence on the planet has increased far faster than the numbers of humans and their animals through the growth of the global economy. If you compare 1900 and the year 2000, the size of the global economy has increased by about 16. One index of economic activity is the use of energy. In 1860, the average person used a little bit less than 1 megawatt hour of energy per year. Now, what does that mean, 1 megawatt hour of energy per year? Well, it turns out that energetically, I am equivalent to a 100-watt bulb, and so are you. That's how much energy it takes to operate each of us in this room, a 100-watt bulb. And if you extend that over a year, it turns out to be 1 megawatt hour per year. So you can think that in 1860, the average person on the planet had one energetic slave, the equivalent of one slave in human energy, from inanimate energy from all sources. By 1991, the average person on the planet had 19 energetic slaves trailing him or her around. The lights up here, the loudspeaker, the jet plane that brought me out here, the elevator in the hotel, all of that energy that we are consuming could fuel 19 people, okay? At the same time, the number of people on the planet went from a little bit more than 1 billion to about 5.3 billion in 1990. So the total amount of inanimate energy is the product of the amount per person times the number of persons, and if you multiply 5 times 19, you get 95. So in the course of 130 years, our inanimate energy production amplified by about 100-fold, 95. Let's not be too precise, 2 orders of magnitude. This is another presentation of data I got at Harvard. What it shows you is that the overwhelming share of the increase in the recent decades is through oil. That's what this blue patch is. Fossil fuels. Coal is down here, and you see that coal and oil and gas together constitute the bulk of our energy diet. Well, in addition to energy and material inputs, people are a major factor in the economy. And women like these are a majority of the world's farmers. In 1970, I'm sorry this is out of focus, and I don't know if there's anything I can do about it. Focus, I can. Let's see. Does that make it better or worse? It doesn't do anything. Is it readable? Okay. In 1970, for every 100 men who were in the labor force, that means either in a job or looking for work, there were 37 women. By 1990, for every 100 men, there were 62 women, almost twice as many. So the economically active population, people looking for jobs, rose much faster than the number of people of working age because of economic and cultural changes in the roles of women. It's not an accident that as this transition happened, fertility began to fall from its peak around 1965-70 to much lower values now. Women moved from childbearing to labor. And here are 3 Bangladeshi women who illustrate the problem that we have not yet satisfactorily resolved, how to balance the roles of production. Their job is to take big pieces of gravel and make small pieces of gravel, and the job of reproduction. And they are trying to do a juggling act in one of the poorest countries. So now let me tell you a good news, bad news story about the economy. Well, I'm sorry, I'll come back to that. Over the last 70 years, there has been a shift in the relative relations of the poor and the rich countries. In 1930, the poor countries exported food to the rich countries. They were grain baskets. Since about 1940, since World War II, the poor countries have become more and more food deficits relative to the rich countries. World cereal yields, that is, metric tons of grain per hectare, have risen almost linearly over this period, and the fact that this has not leveled off is due in very substantial part to the contribution of my fellow Laureate, Professor Chang. While the yields went up, the prices went down. This is the price for rice, for wheat, and for maize. This was the oil spike, but in general, the long-term trend, this is the good news. The price of food at the end of the 20th century is less than it has been ever. Now, world per capita cereal production actually reached a peak in the late 80s and has since come down. Is that a cause for alarm? Well, there are three things going on which should be understood. One is that some of the rich countries, including the US and Europe, have taken land out of production in response to the fall in price, because their farmers didn't feel they were getting their money back from the low prices. So if you can reduce the supply, the price should go up. The second thing that happened is that the Soviet Union collapsed and a lot of its land became unproductive. It was no longer growing food. And the third thing that happened is much subtler, and that is that even though the amount of food per person in the poor countries continued to increase in this region, and the amount of food per person in the rich countries continued to increase during this period, the fraction of the world's population in the poor countries grew, so that there were more people who were getting the better but smaller diets of the poor countries, and fewer people, relatively, who were getting the better but bigger diets of the rich countries. So if you can think about that a little bit, you can see that the shift in population distribution contributed to this apparent decline. It does not mean that we're unable to produce the food. Well, the consequence is a good news story, and that is that the number of people chronically hungry has fallen over the last several decades from about 1 billion to 750 million. Now, 750 million hungry people is still far, far too many. And in Africa, the number of chronically hungry people has been rising. It has risen by 2/3, from 100 to 168 million. It's roughly steady at 1/3 of the population. Every third person in Africa is chronically undernourished, not getting enough calories to do what I do, which is walk around and talk with people. Notice that Africa also had the highest population growth rate of any region during this period. So people who say that population growth is limited by food simply aren't in touch with the facts, which are that the fastest growing region has the highest proportion of hungry people. And the fall in food prices is a general phenomenon. If you take the 1990 price as 100, the price of petroleum fell from 113 in 1975 to 76 in 1992. Now, we've had a recent price spike, but immediately prior to that price spike, certainly the price of petroleum was as low as it's been in the last half century. Non-fuel commodities dropped, agricultural commodities dropped, metals and minerals dropped. The only thing that went up was timber, because we don't know how to grow trees faster. We haven't developed technology for that. So that's the good news. And here's the bad news. It's increasing inequality between rich and poor. So what I want to do with you conceptually is make a list of all the world's countries and rank them by income per person from high to low. Go down the list from the top until those countries have 1/5 of all the world's people. Okay? In 1960, those countries had 70.2% of all the world's income. Now, if you go up that same list from the bottom until you get 1/5 of all the world's people, in 1960, those countries had 2.3% of all the world's income. Okay? The ratio of this amount to that amount is about 30 to 1. So the average person in the top fifth had 30 times the income of the average person in the bottom fifth. If you do the same exercise again in 1970, it's about the ratio of incomes per person is about 32 to 1. In 1980, it's 45 to 1. In 1991, it's over 60 to 1. So we've had growing inequality in economic income. So now here's a question for you. How is it possible that 750 million people still lack enough food to grow normally and walk around, while food prices have dropped by half? The answer is that the bottom billion people who lack money are economically invisible. Their wants and needs are not reflected by international prices because they don't participate in markets. In other words, if you're hungry and you don't have any money to go to the market and buy, the market price doesn't reflect your physical need. It only reflects what is called effective demand. You have to have money to play in the market. So our prices show abundance of food because they're falling, but they don't reflect actual hunger. Okay. So now I am finished with population and economics. Let's go on to the environment, and we're going to do this quick. This is a garbage dump in Warrington, Great Britain. We have discovered that there is no longer any way to throw things away to. Who knows what the highest point on the eastern seaboard of the United States is? Long Island, no. 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 No, on the seaboard. The highest thing on the seaboard of the east coast of the United States is the Fresh Kills garbage dump on Staten Island. And it is 9 square kilometers in surface area and 100 meters high, and it is the largest structure by volume that humans have ever made. It is visible from the moon, and it has bigger volume than the Great Wall of China. So there is simply, and it's so high now that it's mechanically unstable, and it's going to be closed next year. So there's no longer any way to throw things away to. This is another scene from New York. This is Love Canal. People make plutonium and toxic chemicals as well as green revolutions. This is western Vancouver Island. Once eroded, the soil on these slopes will not come back for a very long time. In tropical countries, as population density increases, the fraction of land covered by forest decreases. It's a more complicated story than just that because, as you can see, there's a lot of variation within same levels of population density, but there is a relationship. Economic activity is responsible for the extinction of 98% of the animal extinctions since 1600. This is a complicated slide, and I think maybe, well, I'll just point out one thing. And this is world population, 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. We reached 3 billion in 1960. Up to 1960, the area of cultivated land increased in direct proportion to the population. Since 1960, the area of cultivated land has been virtually constant. Some land has come into cultivation, some land has been taken out of cultivation, but the area of arable land has been constant, and the yields have increased. We cannot go back to traditional agriculture. Once we pass 3 billion people, there isn't enough arable land to feed people with traditional low-intensity agriculture. That means we have no alternative but to use these nitrogen fertilizers if we want to have more than 3 billion people. So there is a trade-off between the environmental effects and our desire to feed our own population. And we passed that threshold around 1960. Well, you're familiar with these environmental problems, so I'm not going to repeat headlines. I've talked about population, economy, and environment. And I've talked way too long, but I want to emphasize that culture is important, and I'm going to do it with one illustration. This is a shocking illustration, and if it bothers you, just look away. But I want to make a point. This is from the New York Times, March 26, 1993. This is a vulture, and this is a young girl in the Sudan. And the caption says, "In a move meant to placate the West, the Sudanese government is opening parts of the country's famine-stricken south to relief operations. For some, it could be too late. Well, does this show that Africa has exceeded its human carrying capacity? I would argue that it's more complicated than that. First of all, there was an environmental problem. The rains didn't come in the south, and that was largely a natural event. Secondly, the crops failed. That's partly a consequence of the absence of rains, and partly an economic event, because nobody invested in dams and irrigation to assure water in the face of a predictable drought. Third, it's a further economic failure because there was no market to meet the demand for food, and there was no cash in the hands of these poor people to buy the food. A breakdown of economic institutions. Fourth, there was a political conflict. People in the South, where this girl came from, rebelled against the central government. And the government decided it was cheaper to starve the people than to shoot them one by one. So this girl's starvation is a result of a deliberate political choice. I thought that was enough for a while, and then I read a little bit about the history of the Sudan. There's a fifth and historical dimension to it. Sudan was created by colonial powers, and when the colonial powers left, they drew the boundaries in such a way as to reward the people who had collaborated with them and punish the people who had rebelled against them. So they gave authority to the government, to the tribes from the north who had collaborated and who had for a long time hated the people from the south. So the colonial powers, as I understand the history, set up a situation, and I ask, what is our responsibility, both for this person individually and historically? I leave that without an answer because I don't have one. This is one more point on the role of culture. This is a boy and a girl. If you look carefully at this picture, they're carrying the same stuff over the same rocks. The only difference is that the boy has shoes and the girl does not have shoes. That's a choice. Now, it's obviously an inequitable choice, but I want to make the point that it is economically inefficient in the sense that allocating investments like shoes or education on the basis of gender will yield a lower return than allocating investments on the basis of capacity and performance, because gender is a poor predictor of capacity and performance. Here's a case where gender bias is not economically rational, but gender bias is produced by culture. Okay. So how many people can the Earth support? I've got a few minutes left to answer the question you came here to hear answered. I spent several years collecting all the published reports that I could find. And I've plotted them on this graph by the year of publication and on a log scale by the number of billions of people that these authors estimated the Earth could support. So this is 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion, 1,000 billion, or 1 trillion. And we are here at about 6 billion, right here. There are three things to learn from this slide. In the last half century, from 1950 to the year 2000, the estimates have ranged from fewer than 1 billion, to more than 1 trillion. So now you know the answer. Somewhere between 1 billion and 1 trillion. Well, they can't all be right, or there isn't a single right answer. The second thing is that there is increasing scatter. Now, if we were measuring the speed of light, you would expect to get different answers at the beginning by using different methods. And after you refine the methods and you calibrate one against the other, you'd expect the answers to come together. Here it's going the other way, which tells you we are not measuring a constant of nature. These are political numbers presented by people who want to argue that we already have more people than we should have or can support, or that there's no problem if we have a large number of more people. They make different assumptions and they use different methods. And the third thing is, there is no increasing or decreasing trend here. the middle of the distribution is just about where we are now. So maybe we ought to be interested in the question. To understand why there is so much variation, we have to look at the methods. And I'll tell you briefly what these are without going into details. The first method works like this. It's true because I say so. That's the method of assertion. And the advantage of that method is that it does not take a lot of data. But the drawback is that it has a very wide standard deviation. The second method is the method of maximum density, and that is the method that was used for the very first estimate published in 1679 by Antony von Leeuwenhoek, the guy who invented the microscope. He did the following calculation. He says, in a letter to the Royal Society in London, I live in Holland. Holland has 1 million people. Holland is 1 part in 13,400 of all the habitable land on the earth. It's inconceivable that the world could be more densely settled than my Holland is today, 1679. Therefore, the maximum population of the earth is 1 million times 13,400, or 13.4 billion people. A very good method because it takes account of all of the activities people use space for. Living, farming, water collecting, forestry, recreation. Everything is wrapped up in that one estimate. There's one small drawback. There are now 15 times as many people in that same area as there were then. And if you use the same method today, you'd get an answer on the order of several hundred billion people, which many people find implausible. This method was later refined by dividing the Earth up into latitudinal bands. I won't go into the details. The second method is the method of curve fitting, and I'll just summarize briefly an example of that. You have a mathematical curve that was fitted to the population of the United States up to 1910. The United States paid attention to this curve until about 1950, and then the United States went its own merry way, paying no attention to the prediction that the maximum population of the United States ever would be 197 million. We are currently at about 270 million. This same method was used to predict that the maximum population of the world would be 2 billion. It's now 6 billion. So that was discredited. The next method is the method of single limiting factors, and it looks scientific. Let's pretend that the world is limited by the amount of food, because everybody has to eat, obviously. So we estimate the maximum global food production, and we divide it. We take this maximum food production, we divide it up into as many little pieces as we can, each little piece being just sufficient to feed somebody. So we find how many little pieces fit into that total maximum. And that tells you the maximum number of people you can feed. Well, that's great, except what is the maximum global food production? Well, as we saw, the food production has more than doubled since World War II. In fact, it's about tripled. And what's the minimum individual food requirement? An Indian lives on about 200 kilograms of grain per year. An American consumes about 800 kilograms of grain per year, most of it passed through domestic animals. An Italian consumes about 400 kilograms of grain per year and has a longer life expectancy than either an American or an Indian. So what is the minimum individual food requirement? And by the way, what is food? Some people look at a cow and see a holy animal. Other people look at a cow and see a Big Mac on wheels. Some people look at a dog and see a pet. Other people see a square meal. If food were biologically determined, then cockroaches would be in great demand. But the fact is, food is a culturally defined thing. And what is acceptable food is culturally defined. So this is not as objective as it looks. And by the way, I started off with the assumption that food is what limits population. Other people have said, more than any other factor, availability of water determines the ultimate population capacity of a geographic province. And if you look through the scientific literature, you find this identical statement with water replaced by food, land, energy, fresh water, nitrogen, phosphorus, light, soil, space, diseases, and so on. They never check which one of these intervenes first, and which one really is a limiting factor, if any. Well, I'm going to skip the other methods because time is getting short. And I want to get to the question, want to get to the question, how many people can the Earth support? I claim the question is incomplete. And in order to make the question complete, you have to answer at least 11 additional questions. So let's walk through these and then we'll be done. One is, how many with what average level of material well-being? How much food, how much fiber, water, housing, industrial output, health, and so on? Secondly, how many people can the Earth support with what distribution of material well-being? Is everybody going to be well off, or is it going to be like a Ceausescu Romania, with one wealthy dictator and the rest of the people living in absolute poverty? How many people with what technology? Are we going to plow with a stick or with a satellite-controlled tractor? How many with what domestic and international political institutions? I used to use the example of Czechoslovakia versus Yugoslavia. Czechoslovakia had ethnic differences, and to resolve them, they held a referendum and split the country into two, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, and no blood was shed, and their housing stock was completely intact. Yugoslavia had ethnic differences, and instead of holding an election, they made a profession of killing each other and destroying each other's housing stock, so that many of those refugees do not have places to go back to. The number of people that that territory of Yugoslavia can support depends on their political mechanisms for resolving conflicts. Politics counts. How many people can the Earth support with what domestic and international economic arrangements? My country is a small island filled with bird dung, guano, okay? It's got a lot of phosphorus. It's the best fertilizer in the world. Your country has a huge area, but the soil is sterile, doesn't grow a thing. If you and I don't trade, we're going to both go hungry. If you and I trade, I sell you my bird guano, you grow food, I buy your food with the money I got for the bird guano. We're both better off. So that international trading institutions make a difference. This is an idealized example due to David Ricardo, but they make a difference in how many people the Earth can support. And this example shows what was wrong with my earlier picture of population, environment, economics, and culture. I only showed one such pyramid for the whole globe. But in fact, there are hundreds or thousands or millions of different pyramids at different places, and they interact over long distances. They interact demographically through migration. They interact economically through the financial institutions, through trade. They interact environmentally through the global commons. Did you know that the exhaust that comes out of the taxi that takes me from the airport here and the exhaust from a coal-fired power plant in Beijing mix in the atmosphere in about 6 days? They are totally mixed in the northern hemisphere in about 6 days. There is no way we can deal with the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere without involving China, because that's just the way the world is built. And fourth, in addition to population, economics, and environment, they interact culturally through Chinese restaurants and Levi jeans and French perfumes and Italian pizzas, or wherever that came from, actually. So it's an interacting system, and that makes it more complicated than one at a time. How many people can the Earth support with what domestic and international demographic arrangements? Do we have migration or not? Who takes care of the children? In China, it's a constitutional requirement that families take care of their elderly. In the United States, it seems to be nobody's responsibility. That will determine how many people the Earth can support. How many can the Earth support with what physical, chemical, and biological environment? Do we want a world that consists of people and wheat only, or do we want to have a few other species around for our entertainment and pleasure? With what variability or stability, with what risk or robustness? Do we want to settle where the hurricanes are going to hit Florida and the floods are going to flood the Mississippi Valley? Or do we get a higher carrying capacity, but we get a higher risk? What trade-off should we make there? That's a choice. For how long do we want to look ahead into the future? 5 years, 50 years, 500 years? And what values, tastes, and fashions? What do we want out of our lives? Now, why do I talk about values? Values determine how parents trade off the number of children against the quality of their children. How parents choose between parents' right to reproduce and children's right to eat. Those choices will change in time, and so will how many people can the earth support. Let's put together the picture. Here's the history. This is again on a log scale. The fact that this is curved upward means that the population is growing faster than exponentially, because if it were exponential growth, it would be a straight line on a log scale. Super exponential growth. Here are the limits estimated, and here's where we are. We're just running into the zone of limits, so-called estimated. And here are 3 future projections. If we continued growing as we would grow in 1990, we'd have 794 billion people by the middle of the following century. That's not going to happen, I think. If everybody in the world decided to have exactly 2 children as of 1990, the population would level off at about 8 billion sometime in the middle of the next century. And if everybody in the world decided as of 1990 to have just 1.7 billion, 1.7 children per woman, the population would still rise to 8 billion and then gradually fall. This is a world we have to choose. The Earth's human population has moved into a zone where limits on population size or well-being have been anticipated. In my view, neither panic nor complacency is in order. In the coming century, we and our children, and that means a lot of you, are less likely to face absolute limits than difficult trade-offs. Trade-offs among population size and economic well-being and environmental quality and our own values. Foresight and action now might make some of these trade-offs easier. Thank you very much. Those who need to leave are free to do so without embarrassment, and I will welcome questions and attempt to answer. And if I can't answer, I'll ask David Hare.
Is there a politician?
Just a moment. I saw a hand back there. Yes, sir.
So what are your ideas for like some strategies?
I couldn't hear because the door slamming. Could you?
What is your ideas of some strategies upward and what do you think about considering state relations in the United States and that will stop
Okay, 2 questions. What do I think about? What do I propose to deal with the problems that I anticipate here? And secondly, what do I think about gay relations in the United States as a method of dealing with population growth? Is that correct? Oh, generally. Okay. Well, let me review briefly for you the actions that have been proposed, and they fall into 3 categories: bigger pies, fewer forks, and better manners. The bigger pie school says, let's use technology and just keep increasing our capacity to produce so we can eliminate poverty by more production of food and goods. The fewer forks school says, let's slow population growth, and I'll get to the ways that have been proposed to do that, and let's reduce consumption of those who already are here. And the better manners school says, let's diminish the inequities between men and women. Let's have more efficient economic institutions. Let's have less corrupt governments, things like that. Okay? Let's stop subsidizing the exploitation of our natural resources as we do in the United States, for example. Now, the methods that have been proposed to slow population growth have gone like this. After World War II, the first strategy was a condom in every pot, or that's a play on a chicken in every pot, but the idea was to push family planning so that everybody got family planning. That did not entirely succeed in many countries. So the next response was from the developing countries themselves, who said, development is the best contraceptive. Give us foreign aid and help us develop economically, and our population problem will take care of itself. The next strategy was, let's reduce infant mortality so that parents don't have to have 6 children to be sure that 2 of their children will survive. The next strategy was, let's educate women. Because when women, for example, if you compare a woman with no education and a woman with 6 years of primary education, she has on the average about 3 fewer children. So let's make sure that women get educated. Somebody woke up and realized, gosh, it takes women and men to make babies. Why don't we educate men too? And finally, most recently, people have come up with the idea, let's do all of those things. Development, family planning, reproductive health, educate women, educate men. I think they're all good ideas. My own favorite, what I would like to see happen is, I think we should declare it as a matter of right that every child in the world between the ages of 6 to 16 should be in a good school getting some good education. And I think the rest of the problems would actually then be easier to address. But in order to do that, get every child from age 6 to 16 in a good school, you also have to solve a lot of other problems. Like they have to have enough food in their bodies so that their brains work, and so that they're not full of worms, which a lot of children are. A lot of children are walking bags of worms. And you have to have telecommunications so that they can get knowledge. And you have to have roads so that they can get to school. And you have to have social organizations so that girls aren't afraid of being attacked when they go to school. So there are lots of problems that have to be solved at the same time. And I think that that would be something I'd like to see. I'd like to see every kid, age 6 to 16, in a chance to get educated. As for the gay relations solution to the world population problem, I really, I don't think, let's say that 10% of the population is gay, okay? So if you just take away 10% from, the total fertility rate now is 2.9 children per woman, okay? If you just take 10% off of that, you take off 0.3, you're still at 2.6. Population is going to still keep going up. So I don't think that quantitatively, I don't think that's going to do it. There's got to be more going on. Well, that's a choice people have to make. That's not for me to say. Sir.
We've had now 3 national conferences on population growth, and still we see the growth continuing. And all 3 of these national conferences, the main obstacles have been the Islamic countries and the Vatican. We really didn't get into that, but they're clearly against family planning, contraception, and so on. And yet, a great deal of the population growth, particularly in South America, which is going on in heavily Catholic countries. What fields do you think might work that might persuade the Vatican and Islamic countries to perhaps buy into or adopt some more effective population growth measures?
Well, let me give some factual background. The first country in the world in which fertility began to fall was France, and this happened before the French Revolution, second half of the 18th century. The peasants followed the example of the nobility, who are all, okay, go back even further. Early 18th century, French nobility discovered they were having too many sons, they were dividing up the lands, and the sons couldn't make a living on the land that they were getting. So they started reducing their fertility. We know that from the genealogies. They had fewer sons than they would have had if they were just naturally reproducing. The peasants said, oh, they're not so dumb. We'll do the same thing. By the middle of the 18th century, coitus interruptus was very widely practiced in France, and fertility began to fall. Okay? Since World War II, fertility in Latin America has dropped from 6 children per woman to 3 children per woman. Today, fertility is lowest of all countries in the world in France, in Italy and Spain, about 1.2, 1.3 children per woman. Fertility among Catholics in the United States is indistinguishable from that among Protestants, except in a few large cities where there are large conclaves of Catholics. So the Catholic people have voted with their feet, or whatever it is that they use for this activity, and are perfectly aware of where their true self-interest lies. And the Catholic doctrine of educating women has been a very powerful contraceptive force. And the Catholic doctrine of community responsibility for the well-being of people in the community has had a tremendous effect in lowering fertility. The only problem is with a few celibate men in the Vatican who are totally out of touch with their own people. And I think that the Vatican has been extremely obnoxious, obstructive at a political level, but at the village level there are plenty of priests who encourage their people to go to health clinics because they see the woman has 6, 3, or 5 children. So there's a huge gap between the doctrine at the top and the operations down below. And you have to respect people's choices even if you disagree totally with the doctrine at the top. That's my situation. As for Islam, Islam does not have a prohibition against contraception. It doesn't even prohibit first trimester abortions. The problem there, and yet the area of the world with the highest total fertility rate is Islamic. TFR is around 6 children per woman, slightly beginning to drop now in a few Islamic countries. It's not the religion that's the problem, it's the position of women in the culture where that religion is widespread. And when women are kept home and not allowed to do anything else, guess what? They have babies. So I think the solution is cultural change. If you meet any modern Islamic women from Turkey or Egypt in the United States, they're as sophisticated as anybody, and they have very low fertility. They and the Jews are at the bottom in terms of fertility. And it's not the religion. You know, the Jews have a range from the Orthodox who have 10 children to the Reform who don't have any. And there's everything in between. I don't think it's religion. I think it's what is the cultural status of women and what do men expect in their family. So how you change the Vatican, I mean, I know the astronomer royal for the Vatican, the Vatican astronomer. You know, he's a scientist, he's a professor. I mean, he knows what's going on. He just can't do anything. Yes, ma'am. What do I know about the percentage of the world that's vegetarian and what's the future? I don't know what the percentage is, but there are a lot of people who are vegetarians involuntarily because they're too poor to afford meat. The first thing that happens when people get richer is that they want more animal protein in their diet. And that's what's happening in China, tremendous demand for pork. And that's what's happening in India. As people get richer, they want meat. After a certain point, some people find out maybe they don't want so much meat. So you have to get over that hump first. I do not have any predictions about what will happen in the developed countries, but I can assure you that in the poorer countries, as people get richer, they're going to want more meat. That is the way it goes. That's an empirical fact. And there's even a law. The economists have a name for that law. I don't remember what it is, but there's going to be more demand for meat. I'm not recommending it, but I'm saying that's what it will be.
But I mean, there's a growing cultural sort of idea
I think it has to.
Is that seen as possible as well?
In the long term, it's entirely possible. I mean, you know, look at Bertrand Russell, look at G.B. Shaw. There are lots of people who argued, and they're always a couple of centuries ahead of the rest of the world, that that's the way to go. Whether it is the way to go is a matter of choice for a lot of people. And, you know, that's public discussion, cultural change. Yes, sir.
I need to comment about educating personal computers and investment in stocks.
Can't hear the question.
Okay, I'll repeat it as soon as he finishes.
Might have a big implication when some of the people, perhaps the most wealthy, are moving out of the tax countries into any hilltop that they want to go to. Those computers get into the rest of humans to raise their potential deployment and involve them in the full community.
What's the potential of computing and telecommunications to accelerate this process? I think it's enormous, and I think we don't have to lay copper anymore. You've got satellites that go around the world. You know, you can download, but you need some support. You need somebody who knows, gosh, what's happening to this crappy operating system Microsoft has just dumped on me. So you do need support, but I do think that computers have a tremendous potential, and telecommunications, to accelerate this process. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Just excuse me, the lady behind you, and then next. Okay? The question was, what do I think AIDS will do to population growth, especially in Africa? It was anticipated that the 6 billion day would be sometime in the middle of this summer. And then the UN said, in order to dramatize and to recognize the fact that AIDS is killing a lot of people, they set the date back by several months, from something like June to October. That gives you the scale of the effect. In a rapidly growing population, the AIDS belt across the middle of Central Africa are about 15 countries in which the adult prevalence of AIDS exceeds 15%. In some countries, it's as much as 20, 25, and 30%. Huge fraction of the population dying of AIDS. What does that do? It kills people often after they reproduce. And so the doubling time of the population gets stretched out. But in these populations, it gets stretched out from 22 years to double to 24 years to double. It's not either a humane or effective solution to rapid population growth. In sub-Saharan Africa, 1 out of 6 women aged 15 to 19 is pregnant with childbearing. Okay, 1 out of 6. In the more developed countries, it's 1 out of 25, 1 out of 20. So there's tremendous high fertility among the very young, and you know, if you're childbearing at age 15, 16, 17, 18, you get AIDS. You may die at 30. You may have had 3 children. It's what does that leave you with? It leaves you with a deficit in the most productive years and millions of orphans. So it is a catastrophic situation we don't know how to cope with it. It's a catastrophe. But it's not going to solve the population growth problem. Now, sir, excuse me.
We worry so much about population for various factors. How to stand for that. It seems to me the population problem is also really the most acute problem that and population and countries together. For them, we make time. Chinese population, all of them spend as much as we do. Everybody.
Yes, sir.
Everybody else on the world spend as much as probably looking out right now. That could be a good time opportunity.
Well, I think that yeah. How are we doing for time? Okay, a couple more minutes. I think that both the rich and the poor countries have population problems, but they are not the same. I think rapid population growth in the poor countries makes life harder for the children who are born and for the adults who are already there. On the other hand, in the United States, something like 57% of all conceptions are either mistimed or unwanted at the time of conception. So a very large fraction of pregnancies were not intended by parents at the time that they occur. Of those, a majority end in abortion, about 1.5 million or more per year. And the result is that a large number of children are born to parents who either didn't want them then, or about 500,000 births are to parents who didn't want them, period. That is, in my opinion, a rather severe handicap to start life under. So I think the United States has unwanted pregnancy. We have the highest level of unwanted pregnancy of any industrial democracy. Now, are Americans stupider than the French and the Dutch and the Germans and the English and the, can't figure out how to use a condom or something? I mean, we're not that dumb. So I think we have that population problem. A second population problem that some people see as a population problem, I'm not so sure, is our rapid aging. Other people see immigration as a problem. It certainly is a cultural issue, how we deal with it. And people have wildly different values about that. But I think that as long as there is poverty surrounding the rich countries, the question of immigration is not going to go away. And so I think that our well-being is linked to the population and poverty problems in the poorer countries. I think you're right that not everybody in the world could live like an American. I just don't think that would work. And fortunately, Americans are shifting to an information-rich economy. And it's possible that many developing countries will be able to go to an information-rich economy without going through the material intensive economy that we have now. We were talking about this at lunch. Somebody gave the example of a radio. A radio used to be a device this size. A radio now, I have one that fits in this pocket. And I get the same value, or better reception from my little one. And there are lots of other things that have changed in that way. I don't need to go to the library to get a lot of books. I think it's time. Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it.